to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. We are going to continue our conversation from last week. Yes, it was last week talking about trauma. And I am going to just pause for a second, double check, make sure we are. Yep, we are live. Awesome. Okay, so let me just mute this. Just want to make sure we. Okay, so we can continue. So we are live on YouTube. And we do have, okay, so someone else is there. All right, so let us continue where we left off in this conversation about trauma. Um, considering everything that's happening now, it's, well, not even everything happening now, just in general. Um, I want to start off by just doing a brief recap the things that really stood out to me that you had talked about, just trauma with a big T versus little t.
Mhm.
Those things have kind of been thinking about, mulling in my head. And I know we ended with you mentioning Dr. GiShawn Mance, that you wanted to talk about coping mechanisms because that's a question that often come up. So, welcome to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. And Dr. Mance, do you want to briefly just say some things about yourself again and before we get started?
Sure. I'm excited to be here today. My name is GiShawn Mance. I'm Associate Professor of Psychology at Howard University. I My work primarily focuses on community-based participatory research with an emphasis around community-based, um, trauma-informed community-based interventions. So,
Mhm.
what that means is that I typically partner with communities and identify a mental health concern for that particular community
Mhm.
and implement interventions that are tailored to what their particular concerns and the intervention is trauma informed. Also, a licensed clinical psychologist
Mhm.
with a private practice. Primarily see children and emerging adults, so that's ages roughly 6 till about 25
Okay.
is my primary area of focus, but I also see adults as well.
Okay.
So
Awesome.
focusing on internalizing symptomology, so anxiety, depression, and
Mm.
PTSD.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm going to save the questions that I already have to just have you start by talking about through seeing your working with these communities and seeing children, young adults, what are some coping strategies you've used or recommended for different age groups?
That's a really good question. Um, First, I'm probably going to give a more general response.
Okay.
I often lead with healing, like healing starts in community.
Mm-hmm.
But I always like to clarify that when I'm saying community, community doesn't necessarily mean individuals who live on your street.
Mm.
Community, when I talk about a sense of community, is people who you commune with, who you feel like edify you,
Mm.
who are kind of helping you build, right? And also who are able to give you authentic truths. Um, and so that's the
Mm.
helping to edify and helping to grow.
Mm-hmm.
So community isn't necessarily by happenstance. We live in the same on the same street or in the
Okay.
same zip code. Is regards to community that we develop,
Mm-hmm.
that we cultivate, and that we find at times. Now, the
Okay.
community that we live in and the people who we live among, that is another version of community that sometimes we don't always have
Mm-hmm.
control over who our neighbors are,
Right.
right? And who and what may happen in the neighborhood. But when I say healing, um, healing happens in community. I am speaking of the community that is cultivated,
Okay.
that is curated
Mm-hmm.
and selected, if you will, and that
Okay.
there is a healthy connection for growth, for truth to
Mm.
exist. Um, so, kind of finding, in the literature, we will simplify it and say social support,
Okay.
um, but kind of thinking beyond, like even larger than social support, and putting it in the perspective of what does that look like from a cultural perspective,
Mm-hmm.
kind of looking at that collective healing, as we may go through kind of collective trauma.
Mhm.
So, how does the collective healing? So, the Association of Black Psychologists, they have emancipation circles.
Mhm.
They also um, they used to have, I think it was like every Monday. I forgot what they call it. Was it Zawandi? But they would essentially have either panels or someone kind of speaking more similar to like a podcast on
Mhm.
different mental health issues that were kind of germane or unique to the African diaspora, people from within the African diaspora.
Okay.
Um, so finding that community so that we can heal, beginning to heal in community. There was a term, a colleague of mine, he's now passed, he's an ancestor now, but he
Mhm.
really, a lot of his research centered around the term of Ubuntu, because he focused on positive mental health, and he
Okay.
created a positive mental health model. And
Mm.
he was supposed to be the president-elect for the Association of Black Psychologists, the national president,
Mhm.
but he transitioned, he passed
Oh. Sorry.
last year. But I talked to him often. He written a book. I think
Mhm.
the name title of his book was Ubuntu Musings, I believe. But he really talked about his model in regards to positive mental health,
Wow.
and he talked about how we establish mental health and how it may function, specifically for Black folks.
Mhm.
Kind of recognizing the spirit of Ubuntu.
Okay.
Um, and when we kind of think about the term Ubuntu, essentially is a Zulu term meaning the essence of being human. We
Mhm.
are people because of other people. So you
Mhm.
may have heard folks say, "You are, I am because you are because I am."
Mhm.
So that's that spirit of it. The human spirit is well and whole and healthy. And
Mhm.
so it kind of, the positive mental health model is really talking about the connectedness in community, also having a sense of competency, building those tools and skills that I need that I
Mhm.
can competently face the stressor, um, or stressors that I'm
Mhm.
experiencing. Because remember, we kind of go back to our definition of trauma is when our coping resources are overwhelmed, right?
Mm.
Like how
Wow.
we are cognitive appraisals of an issue. We have our primary appraisal when we first see the issue at hand or the stressor at hand, my perception, how I appraise this event of whether it is something that I can tackle or not
Mhm.
tackle. And then the secondary appraisals are essentially when I go through my toolbox
Mhm.
and I kind of think back, or am I able to, and can I actually execute? Can I
Mhm.
actually implement it? What
Mm.
I feel like this issue needs. And if the answer is no, then I become overwhelmed and I may have a sense, feeling a sense of loss, a sense of helplessness, this difficulty concentrating. So all those symptoms may begin to
Mm.
kind of present themselves.
Mhm.
That trauma, that essentially trauma can impact how we function, how we view the world.
Yeah.
And really, trauma is a shift in how we see the world. The world is no longer a safe space.
Mm. Wow.
When we kind of think about the trauma, whether it's big T or small t, it's like
Right.
that anticipatory anxiety, if you will. Like
Mhm.
my framework of the world being a safe place has been challenged, has been shaken, has been taken
Mm.
away in some way. Um,
Wow.
but thinking about the healing in community and positive mental health,
Mhm.
connectedness, building a sense of community, finding that sense of community, um, and then building those tools of competency. So, as opposed to being reactionary, a lot of times we may react, right? Because
Mm.
we're in that fight or flight,
Right.
fight, flight, or freeze response. So,
Mhm.
it's almost like automatic, but allowing ourselves that moment to give context
Mhm.
so that we appraise, place in context of, am I safe? Can I meet this challenge? Is
Mm.
this beyond what do I have, what power or control do I have in it or not? And
Mhm.
then once we have an honest assessment of that, then either thinking about community, finding within community those who, what I feel like I don't have,
Mhm.
finding those individuals who can provide that for me,
Wow.
who can help me. let's say, trying to think of a trauma. Let's say there's been um, we can even think about it as, let's say there's been violence within the community, and this
Okay.
community has taken a loss collectively.
Mhm.
And the individual families who may have been impacted. So you have the collective trauma and the individual trauma that's happening. How do we heal? Because collectively we've gone through something.
Mhm.
And so we may then begin to lean on one another
Yeah.
because we have this collective experience. And so now there's a safe space so I can talk about it and this person can relate, right?
Wow.
But then the healing, so that's part of the healing of like, I have a space where I can talk about it,
Mhm.
others can relate. And then the other side of it is those who are able to kind of give me resources, whether it's deep breathing, things that help me to reset my central nervous system, things that help me to, whether it's meditation, whether it is more the cognitive aspect of kind of reframing,
Mhm.
um, whether it is something as simple as my basic needs
Mhm.
of folks feeding me or
Mhm.
feeding my family
Wow.
because of the emotional roller coaster that we're on at the time.
Mhm.
Trying to find something to eat or even thinking about what I'm going to eat today becomes stressful.
Wow.
So community are those folks who bring the meals, who ask, they don't ask you what you need, they anticipate it and they just kind of give you what you need.
Mhm.
Because sometimes we're in that sphere of trauma or sphere of grief, we don't know what we need, or it's
Mhm.
hard to verbalize it,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
And so that's just one. I kind of start with that connectedness and community, kind of starting there, and then we can kind of get into some more specific
Mhm.
types of strategies that may or may work. But I can always start with community, and
Mhm.
then we kind of transition as an aspect of community therapy,
Right.
right? And yeah,
Wow. Oh my goodness.
that was a lot, right? That was a lot.
That was a lot. That was amazing. Oh my gosh, I got so much from what you said.
Oh,
Um, so I want to go back to the first one you talked about. You mentioned community. I love that you distinguish between, what a community is in terms of not only who you're able to commune with, but whether or not
mhm,
um, you being a part of that actually leads to healing.
mhm,
And having that define what a community is, it's something we don't talk about, even though it's how we feel, right? If you're in a space where whoever you're surrounded by doesn't lead you towards healing and instead leads you towards trauma, are you in commune with them, right? Are you part of community with them? I am so curious, starting with the first one you mentioned, which is emancipation circles. Could
mhm.
you elaborate more on what that is? And how you've used it and things like that, if you
Yeah.
have.
So those circles were started. So essentially, it was the Association of Black Psychologists
Mhm.
on a national stage, was essentially part of like starting with emancipation circles, and then
Mhm.
the different chapters. They may hold them locally.
Mhm.
Um, and my first kind of knowledge of these emancipation circles was essentially around the time coming out of during COVID, George Floyd,
Mm.
a lot of like political and civil unrest,
Mhm.
a lot of racial trauma, and then kind of thinking from the pandemic, a lot of loss,
Mhm.
a lot of grief. And it was
Mm.
just kind of the accumulation of it, right? A
Yeah.
very, very stressful time
Mhm.
for a lot of people. Um, and out of that, so the whole notion of kind of healing and community, like how do we create community, particularly in a time where coming together
Mhm.
physically wasn't necessarily possible.
Right.
And so that the emancipation circles were essentially started virtually, and I think I'm not sure if they're still holding them,
Mhm.
but they're essentially a space, a safe space where people could come together
Mhm.
and really kind of process the racial trauma that they were
Mm.
experiencing,
Mm.
process the loss and the grief
Mhm.
that they are experiencing,
Right.
and then also kind of really focus on Black mental health and mental wellness, and
Mm.
really kind of focusing on consciousness, really like African or Black consciousness in regards to the substance of being, who you are,
Mhm.
your story, where you've come from.
Mhm.
So, really kind of using cultural and racial knowledge and socialization
Mhm.
as a part of the healing process, right?
Mm.
Where do we see our strength collectively when we're constantly being faced with circumstances where you feel like you don't have power? Even now, and think about this political climate, a lot of
Mhm.
people feel, um, to a certain extent,
Mhm.
powerless,
Mhm.
right? Because you're seeing all these things happen, and they're like,
Right.
how is this happening? Who's going to say something? Why isn't something happening? Like
Mhm.
they're asking these questions. Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
and so it's just allowing the space of like, what can we do? How do we find strength in our collective story?
Right.
um, and then to give positive, healthy ways of how to cope. So whether it's
Mhm.
taking you through EMDR, taking you through
Mm.
meditation and breathing, taking
Mhm.
you through walking exercises,
Mm.
taking you through reframing and cognitive restructuring,
Mhm.
and or connection,
Right.
just by just being in community. Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Wow. It's funny you said that. That's exactly what I was thinking about when you said all of that. I
Mhm.
imagine that those who were not able to relate to that kind of dismantling during racial, um, and I guess in some way dismantling of our dignity can
Mhm.
relate to that a little bit more now. Sometimes it's very hard to understand someone else's trauma without actually going through it yourself and without actually understanding that need. I see a great deal of efforts to reframe,
Mhm.
right, and to understand now that I didn't see then, because many didn't see the connections, but they were always there. um, I'm looking at the second, what you mentioned, the how do you it's a strange question.
Mhm.
You said, initially I thought you said Obutu or Butu. You mind spelling that? It's kind of a
Ubuntu.
weird request.
Ubuntu.
Please.
Ubuntu. Ubuntu.
Ubuntu.
Ubuntu. Ubuntu. It's a Zulu term,
Oh,
South
okay.
African Zulu term.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I was trying to think of the other word. I was like, what is it? Because beyond the emancipation circles, it
Hmm.
was something Mondays. And now I remember, I believe the group used to do it. They call Zola. Um,
Hmm.
and that means healing power. So it's like, um, Zola is love, and
Hmm.
healing power. And kind of think about and discuss this in many forms of Zola. Zola, Zola. So, how
Hmm.
do we express love to ourselves daily?
Hmm.
How do we express love to others,
Hmm.
so that we kind of build the strength and through others that may inspire us?
Hmm.
Um, is how do we kind of what they call Zola up on each other, gonna love up on you, right?
Hmm.
Reminder of who we are as a people. And so,
Hmm.
kind of really thinking about, so the consciousness of making a conscious effort of how I respond in love to
Hmm.
myself,
Hmm.
as well as in community with others, right? And
Oh.
even kind of thinking about the self love and the self awareness from a healing standpoint, particularly when it
Hmm.
comes to trauma. I often um, tell my clients, and I'm sure people even often tell themselves this, and we give each other this
Hmm.
advice, which is show yourself grace,
Hmm.
give yourself grace.
Hmm.
And a lot of times when we're in the midst of trauma or healing from trauma or in grief, we don't always give ourselves grace, because
Hmm.
sometimes we try to rush the process. Well, it's
Right.
been X amount of months, it's been X amount of years, or this
Hmm.
happened. That we Healing and time don't always go hand in hand,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Um, and
Yeah.
what I mean by that is you can't always put a time frame on the healing process.
Right.
It just has to be. It just has to evolve. It just has
Hmm.
to. you have to allow it to have the ups and the downs and the setbacks, and it's a process, it's a journey.
It's a journey, absolutely. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You know, I think the interesting thing about that journey too is it's sometimes if you're not actually a part of the journey or even haven't begun the journey, it's hard to appreciate it, right? I think even in listening to what you talk about and some of the rituals, I think if you asked me, I don't know, years ago, um, before maybe going through some challenges, you don't think I would have appreciated it as much,
Mhm.
and I say that intentionally because I think, depending on your background, it's very hard to appreciate or even embrace that this could be meaningful, right? And mean something. It's almost like breathing, right? Or meditation. I I've been in classes where they've used and talked about meditation and mindfulness and things like that, um and I've seen it even in other cases with other folks where it's just not as important, as meaningful, or can almost seem nonsensical if you don't think you need it, right?
Mhm.
Until maybe something has triggered and help you to understand, um that this, until you really need to reset. How is that, right?
Mhm.
Until you're in a position where you know that in order to function properly you need to reset.
Yeah.
um and when it's hard to appreciate for yourself, it's hard to appreciate that someone else might need it even if you don't,
Mhm.
right? You
Yeah.
were going to say something.
Well, when as you were talking, I was
Mhm.
thinking, I'm like, my clients who are resistant to it, some are resistant to it, some have embraced. And again, it depends upon where they are in their journey,
Mhm.
if they've had what experiences that they've had. But what came to mind as you were speaking is when sometimes that resistance is comfort. We're
Mm.
comfortable. Sometimes we're
Mm.
comfortable with what we know,
Mm.
even though what we know, when I'm thinking about coping or resources,
Mhm.
don't necessarily work for us.
Right.
It helps us to be on autopilot so
Mm.
we can still function.
Right.
And so because then that becomes the status quo. I can function. I can get up, I can go to work, I can eat. So
Mhm.
I am surviving,
Yeah.
but you're not thriving.
Mm-mm.
And so when I
Mm.
folks were like, I don't want to do the mindfulness, that doesn't work for me. I don't need
Mm.
because sometimes we're so engrossed in a culture that we feel like there's this action, very action oriented. And what I mean
Mhm.
by that is if I do A, then I'll get B, and then here comes C. And these things kind of fall in the order. They're very almost like there's some rigidity to a certain
Mhm.
extent, and maybe even linear, a linear way of kind of thinking about
Mm.
things, whether it's a problem or relationships or whatever. Uh,
Mm.
but sometimes we have to kind of think about how other ways of existing beyond the cultural norm of what we know. Like
Wow.
we know linearity, but maybe
Mhm.
there's a circle.
Wow.
And let's explore this circle, right? Um,
Yeah.
so this idea of like the breathing doesn't do anything for me.
Mhm.
I'd rather do something active, I'd rather go run. Well, in
Right.
running, you're breathing. It's just that
Mhm.
here I'm asking you to sit in the stillness,
Still. Mhm.
but you're just like your body's going and maybe that works for you, but let's just try. That's where the openness comes from, like that
Mhm.
where the openness comes into play, a part in different strategies. Like, well, let's just try it, because is that working for you? Yeah, it works for me.
Mm.
Okay, it works for you because you're functioning, but are we thriving? Do we want more? Oh yeah, I want more. I
Mm.
want to feel well. Okay,
Mm.
well, let's just try this. And we can't just try it and once say, oh, no, it didn't work. Because I have clients do that too. Well, I tried it. How many times you tried it? Like
Mm.
once or twice. And then they didn't even really fully try it.
Right.
I'm like, it has to become a practice,
Right.
right? And then you can kind of see the value in it. And then for some folks are like, nope, that just doesn't work for me. Okay, and that's fine too. Let's find what works for you. I'm not going to force anything,
Right.
but let's at least be open
Mm.
to the healing process can look a lot of different ways,
Wow.
right? Uh-huh.
I always wonder, I'm wondering if it has to do with um, just one, how much we love ourselves, and two, it's almost as if, and I can speak for myself, it's like, do we need to wait until we're just beaten down to the ground, to really give it some attention, right?
Right.
Because as you say that, I'm going through the whole process in my mind and thinking about when I felt like I didn't need it, right? The fact that, yeah, you can engage in it mentally, but your body's still going, so you use your body instead. And really, the moment when I felt like I had to use it, it was no choice, is when I crashed.
Mm.
It wasn't only, it had nothing just to do with the mental, but
Mm-hmm.
my body was just not, I couldn't use my body as well, right? When you've allowed yourself to, um was a word I'm looking for, where you get to the point where burnout,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're in that state of burnout,
Mm-hmm.
um where it's not only mental but it's physical,
Mm-hmm.
then you really have no choice but to just lay there and meditate,
Right.
right? And then there's a mixture of a lot of other mental states that has to do with that, right? We're talking about, sometimes there's depression, whatever it is that immobilizes you. I guess when you can't use your body anymore, you turn to meditation.
Right.
But I think the difficulty is we don't realize when we're not there how far we've fallen.
Mm.
And the fact that when you've fallen so low and allowed yourself to get so low, it takes even more out of you to replenish, right? And to
Mm.
rebuild. And it takes longer, a
Right.
lot longer.
Right.
Um, but it's unfortunate. I think so much, I cling to this song, by Whitney Houston, Learning to Love Yourself is the greatest love of all.
Mm.
I don't think I really began to really understand what that means until you've allowed yourself to give too much, right?
Mm.
Which
Mm.
many of us do,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I think that the journey of self-love,
Mm.
right? Um, again, the word journey, it is a
Mm.
process because we understand ourselves differently through the different developmental stages,
Mhm.
right, and the transitions that come in life.
Mhm.
Um, and when there is a traumatic experience, kind of the the new normal,
Mhm.
kind of trying to identify the new normal, and in the
Mhm.
new normal, trying to find love
Mhm.
and self love. So it's kind of like a redefining again,
Yeah.
finding yourself again. Um, and there's a lot of folks that may say, I love myself. But then when we start doing the real work and asking the
Mhm.
very difficult questions that you have to reflect on,
Yeah.
um, and how does that self love show up when you're in community with others? Like, meaning, how do you
Mm.
treat others?
Right.
Um, are we kind of mindful about how we engage with others? Are we
Mm.
intentional, or is it
Mhm.
just, are we on autopilot and
Mm.
we're kind of like engaging in a way that sometimes the humanness, just being a human, a good
Mhm.
human, sometimes isn't at the forefront. Sometimes it's
Mm.
just, I need to get stuff done. And we're not always thinking about, how do I show love to myself in this situation? And then how
Mhm.
do I show love to others while also meeting whatever our goals are?
Wow.
And that takes a very intentional and conscious process. And a lot of
Mhm.
times we're on autopilot
Yeah.
because we're just getting stuff, we just need to get stuff done. And sometimes it's easy not to feel.
Mm.
Sometimes people like to just hang out in numb land, they're numb. Like,
Yeah.
I just want to be numb. I just don't want to feel at all. If
Mhm.
I don't feel, I don't think about it. I just keep going. I don't have time to be sad, depressed, or angry. Autopilot.
Mhm.
And exactly what you described, what happens is that it's not just the cognitive task, you're a whole person.
Yeah.
So if you're not tending to it, your body is still experiencing that trauma, still experiencing that stress. And just what you stated, your body will crash or
Mhm.
you will get sick. Your immune system
Yeah.
becomes weakened, right? And then
Mhm.
you're more prone to, sickness, viruses, things like that.
Mhm.
Um, and so that the notion I like when you're kind of bringing in like love and what does that look like,
Mhm.
in the journey of self love
Oh,
as part of this process.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. I want to. I do. I looked. I'm looking at the third one before I get to that.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned that you would start generally with community, and then you're thinking of going further in depth. I don't want to interrupt that flow anymore. Was
Oh,
there?
yeah. So individual, so like more from an individual level, because from community, then we would go to family.
Mm.
Skip family for a second and go to like individual.
Mhm.
Because from the individual level, that's where I'm kind of I'm thinking specifically to therapy.
Okay.
Um, and of course, yes, there is family therapy,
Mhm.
but I'm saying and not but.
Mhm.
When it comes to family therapy, you need the family to have buy-in, and that
Mhm.
isn't always the case. And everyone wants to show up, and if
Yeah.
they do show up physically, they are always showing up emotionally
Mm.
or cognitively to really participate, right?
Yeah.
They just want a participation like check because I'm physically there, but not
Mhm.
really allowing themselves to be vulnerable
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
to really kind of do the do the work with the hard questions, right?
Mm.
So going to individual, I'm thinking about therapy, but I'm also kind of thinking about that self-awareness of kind of like how do I identify what my triggers are? What
Mm.
are those things, people, situations,
Right.
smells even
Mhm.
that send me in this place where I feel stressed and overwhelmed or
Mhm.
I am activated, right?
Right.
So being
Mm.
able to identify the triggers, not that you can, so that you can um, avoid them.
Mhm.
Like I know this triggers me, so I'm going to avoid it, so that you will know either how to learn how to handle when that trigger, like that trigger happens and you're activated.
Mhm.
But then to also know there are times where like there are times where distraction and avoidance can be a helpful coping mechanism, but it can't
Mm.
be your only one,
Right.
right?
Mm.
Um, I remember I'm trying to think, there's a saying, it was before healing began, you have to heal yourself was one of, it's like a proverb. Another one
Absolutely.
was that if your only tool is a hammer, you will
Mm.
see every problem as a nail.
Mm.
And that's a proverb as well. And the reason why I'm saying that in regards to like triggers and knowing
Mhm.
kind of knowing your triggers and not using avoidance and distraction as your primary coping strategy. Like I'm just going to distract myself and do something else. I'm
Mm.
going to take care of this other family member. I'm going to eat. I'm going to watch movies. I'm going to sleep.
Yeah.
Um, or sometimes those can be really helpful,
Mhm.
um, the kind of distraction or the avoidance
Mhm.
sometimes can be helpful, but if
Yeah.
that's your only tool, so it goes back to if your only tool is a hammer, if
Right.
your only tool is avoidance,
Mm.
then you will see every problem as a nail,
Wow.
meaning we're not moving towards that healing process. We're not
Mm.
learning how to self-regulate,
Wow.
right? So we're walking around dysregulated and
Mm.
we're calling it I'm just being real, I'm just expressing myself, I'm just expressing my emotions, and we want
Mhm.
everybody else to adjust to us. Like, okay. And we also need to I'm like, okay. And we also let's do some work to kind of identify what, when we're becoming dysregulated
Mm.
and feel those emotions.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we just feel sad.
Mhm.
It's not trauma, you're sad.
Mhm.
Maybe there's a traumatic event that happens, but in this moment, you're feeling sad.
It's just sadness.
It's
Yeah.
just sadness,
Mhm.
or maybe it is fear. You're afraid, and
Mm.
let's explore that
Yeah.
and see how it makes your body react. How does it make you feel? What thoughts come to mind when you are afraid? Then
Mhm.
how do you show up because you're walking in that fear?
Mhm.
And then that fear is definitely based in your reality, your experiences. So let's talk about that. How do we create a safe space around you?
Mm.
So and therapy allows you to do that when we identify
Wow.
our triggers. Um,
Wow.
And then other strategies, I'm a person that feels like there is a power in the narrative.
Mm.
And so journaling,
Yeah.
there is power in the narrative and journaling our thoughts,
Yeah.
our emotions, our anger, our happiness, just being able to journal
Mm-hmm.
is a point of reflection, but also release,
Mm.
right?
Wow. That makes sense.
Yeah. Um,
Wow.
so these are just from the individual, kind of like when we're thinking about like trauma, but
Mm-hmm.
specifically these overwhelming emotions
Mm.
that we have or overwhelming stressors that lead us to feel dysregulated, feeling lost, feeling numb, feeling like I'm just existing, I'm on autopilot, feeling unstable,
Mm-hmm.
moving towards wellness. Like I want to feel well.
Mm-hmm.
Well doesn't mean I'm happy all day.
Right.
It just feels like no, I feel well. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like my head is clear. I can make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I feel healthy. Like I can go for a walk.
Mm-hmm.
I can allow myself to do movement, and movement is another strategy. So whether it is walking, running, stretching,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's
Wow. Stretch. Mm-hmm.
dance, just get yourself moving.
Wow.
Moving allows your central nervous system, and when it feels overwhelmed, to reset.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's
Wow.
why you may hear your therapist tell you to go for a walk.
Yeah.
And being outside in nature as
Mm-hmm.
well can be very therapeutic, and allow space for a lot of different things that can happen in nature. The fresh
Mm-hmm.
air, um, the walking.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes you can go for a walk somewhere on a trail and just scream.
Mm.
Just scream.
Absolutely.
Right. Right. And
Wow.
it's the release. It's the release. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
intense emotion. I need to release it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm doing it in an environment, in a place that it doesn't cause harm to myself or others.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Wow.
once I let it all out, then now let's action. Now let's move forward. What is the action that I can be well?
Mm.
And what does well look like for you? Because what looks like well for you may not be well for me.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of so that's why I'm looking at the individual level of kind of these different strategies, of wellness, self-aware, love,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then kind of concrete actions of like journaling, movement, um,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes just taking a pause,
Yeah.
just taking a pause. Um, we
Wow.
don't always have to jump and do things, just kind of taking a pause, take
Mm-hmm.
a moment. Sometimes you have to create your pause and your stillness,
Yeah.
because life is going to keep going. People are going to always want their responses, right? But you need a
Yeah.
pause, because in this moment, I'm still dealing with this trauma that happened, whether it is um, the offense that someone did to me, whether it is a loss,
Mm-hmm.
whether it is um, the loss of a relationship,
Mm-hmm.
um, racial trauma, like that event still resonates with you. It happened to you. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to take the pause, because life is still going. It
Yeah.
didn't happen to them, it happened to you. Right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Wow. That's a mouthful there. That's amazing. It's I guess I'll ask this question now because one of the things that keeps coming up for me, and it's not so much that I think it's mostly coming up because I've dealt with a lot of it and wanting to move life to the next level. You mentioned where it is. You mentioned something about in terms of just finding. Oh my goodness, I love where you talked about trauma being the fact that coping resources are overwhelmed. Um, but one of the things that keeps coming up for me is there's a shift that I'm seeking and hoping for, especially when it relates to gender.
Mm-hmm.
in our society in general. That keeps coming up because it's also connected. I've seen it in situations where, you talk about the family, right?
Mhm.
And even I've seen it where um, I completely agree with you when you said we have to always start with us, right?
Mhm.
When I think about even raising our child, that's the first thing I thought of. We need to start with ourselves.
Right.
But getting everyone on the same page mean also getting, um, not just your female, but your male partner, right? In therapy and being on the same page with you all. Um, and I mean, I see it. There are amazing benefits to that, which I've seen. Right, you not only learn your each other's triggers, right? You learn there were triggers there that you didn't realize were triggers, right? It's
Right.
it's building a community together, right, where you can both heal and benefit each other. I've also seen in situations where because as a family, when a family did not um, seek that community together and seek that healing together, I've seen families torn apart.
Mm.
But I've also seen when you talk about community, um, just how entrenched um, beliefs about gender, is it's almost like I'm being forced to confront it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because in seeking community in other spaces, I began to see more and more um, where it's almost as if there is a sometimes it's perceived as if there is a partial um I don't want to say a partial romance with a certain I don't want to say well I guess I want to say it, but it's almost as if there is a romance with colonialistic thinking, right? Patriarchal thinking,
Mhm.
um that um that is danced with, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm trying to figure that out as well, right?
Mhm.
Um, I see some questions. I see someone wrote something in the chat.
Going back to my friend who passed, and his talking about his theory of positive mental health. His name is Derek Wilson,
Mm,
and I've done some panels with him. We've co-presented, and one
mhm,
of the things that he would talk about um, is kind of how do we kind of establishing our mental health and talking about femininity,
mhm,
humanity, and masculinity. And he
mhm,
delineated those terms in regards to femininity is being,
mhm,
while humanity is belonging, and masculinity is doing. And when we kind of think about that, we all have these components.
mhm,
It's not like men are masculine and they do. No, women, we all have these components within ourselves that we all have the what we have termed or kind of view as feminine or femininity, and we all have aspects of masculinity, and we
mhm,
all are human and have humanity.
mhm,
And so how do we balance between being, belonging, and doing?
mhm.
And that is the discussion of like that is our mental health, this
Yeah.
balance between being, belonging, and doing.
Mhm,
And kind of that being identifying as who you are and what is that mental wellness is for you, right?
mhm,
And so when we kind of think of like, okay, how do I tap into my doing,
mhm,
my um, kind of feeling like I need to make a decision, I need to, all of those things are part of you. Not
mhm,
saying that, oh, there's a masculine, I'm a man. No, it's part of you, and part of you have all of these
mhm,
aspects and qualities of you, but we've likened that and identified that towards masculinity
mhm,
and the being towards femininity. And how does it show up? When do I need one to show up more than the other? When do I
mhm,
pull on it? Kind of tapping into the being of my emotions
mhm,
of and getting your partner to be like, no, you are a whole person. So
mhm,
as a man, you identify as a male.
mhm.
What does that mean for you?
Right.
Right? Because we we do know within a larger society the traditional roles of male and females look different in different subgroups,
Mhm.
right? So for some Black communities, it may have been more of an exchange of
Mm.
like be, more from a traditional standpoint. It's not the traditional men do this and women do that. It was more of, no, we have to make this work. We
Mhm.
have to, we are basically surviving, and because we're in this very oppressive system, our roles become more fluid.
Mhm.
So may need to go and do what would be traditionally female, and then you may need to go what would be traditionally male,
Mhm.
because the systemic oppression that we are perceiving, or not perceiving, that we are experiencing, is not perceived, but
Mhm.
what we are experiencing
Yeah.
won't necessarily allow the male to be able to have the role that he traditionally has. So maybe
Mhm.
he's not the primary breadwinner, but she is. And thinking about these traditional roles in colonialism, and what does that mean, and then what does that feed into your identity and who you are
Mhm.
within the family system, but then in turn impacts your identity and your mental health.
Mhm.
Am I enough? Am I showing up in my as a man, how I identify as a man or as a woman, or
Mm.
whatever, like
Mhm.
how I identify in these roles,
Yeah.
are large can be largely dictated by this a society that is oppressive.
Right.
And so when we adopt those, we're
Mhm.
kind of in turn adopting more of the oppressive, really internalizing this oppressive system versus the collective, the more collectivist nature,
Absolutely.
and tapping into the being, the belonging, and the doing, the femininity, the humanity, and the
Mhm.
masculinity, and it
Yeah.
being an exchange.
Yeah.
Um, and so, what does that look like? Okay, okay, we have that philosophical conversation. What does that look like when I need? So I'm going to use my family as a model,
Mhm.
or as an example. When
Okay.
I want my husband to go to therapy, after like our family trauma, is
Mhm.
more of us being in community with each other,
Absolutely.
and us kind of saying we want to live well,
Mhm.
and we are surviving right now,
Mhm.
but we want to live well. And
Absolutely.
so when we because of our love for one another,
Mhm.
and my husband's gonna be like, yeah, yeah, we're going to couples therapy.
Mhm.
Yeah, we're going to couples therapy because we're in community with each other, and we
Mhm.
want the same goal. But what
Absolutely.
does it look like when one person's identifying that, we're on autopilot, or we're not even on autopilot, we're not even functioning right now.
Mhm.
We're just existing. And
Yeah.
the other person is like, I'm good.
Mhm.
They're not interested in, I won't say they're not interested in wellness, but they're okay, or they're good, or they are willing to stay where they are.
Mm.
So you're not on the same page. And
Yeah.
so then when you start talking about therapy, and you kind of thinking all these messages, and
Mhm.
your partner's like, no, we don't do therapy.
Mm.
And that's when we have the conversation of,
Yeah.
well, we've been doing what we've been doing. Is it working for us? So it's like, okay, well, then what do you want to do?
Yeah.
And then sometimes you have to go through this exercise of like, okay, we've done all the things that you suggested and it didn't work.
Mhm.
Okay, let's try my suggestion. And then you kind of move there. But again, that's with a partner
Absolutely.
that is willing to meet you. Not even, sometimes it's not halfway. They just, even if it's just a step, okay, I'll meet you with this one step.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. And when you don't want to be, it is an indication of, I believe it's an indication of the extent to which you want to be in community, right?
Right.
And the extent to which you're willing to put that work in,
Right.
because either way it's going to be work, and
Mhm.
you're going to work to be together, or you're going to work hard because you're tearing each other apart, right?
Right.
And so it
Right.
depends on which work do you want to do.
Mhm.
um so I want to turn to, I see some comments in a chat here. Oh, okay. I see Tavisha.
Mhm.
um And I'm only using the names that you all put here where you can see which mentioned emancipation circles equate to safe space, quote unquote, community building in which people are seeking during the times we are in. A lot of people are seeking community. Very, very true.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if you're able to see. Oh,
Um,
it's on the YouTube. So she posted it on
okay.
YouTube.
Okay.
I wish I was able to see it on our. Um, so, any questions? Feel free to post your questions for Dr. Mance here.
And then I had some, we talked about kind of creating community and finding support.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to mention just a couple of um, resources. Um,
Okay,
if
awesome.
folks have, if maybe some folks may or may not have heard of
Mm-hmm.
these resources, and they are specifically for um, their focus more so towards Black mental health and mental wellness. So I
Okay.
want to say that. And a very popular one is therapy for Black girls.
Okay.
Um, they
And I
have
can
a
post these.
yeah, there's a directory of
Mm-hmm.
therapists. You can find a therapist in your area. They
Mm-hmm.
also have there's a podcast. They talk about different kind of issues and topics there as well. But then there's also a lot of resources, whether it's books, articles. There's a weekly like email of like they call it sweet tea. And then it just has like information about like mental health tools.
Okay.
Um, then there's a clinicians of color directory. Again, that's a place where you kind of just find like you put in your location
Mm-hmm.
and essentially what you're seeking therapy for, like anxiety, depression,
Okay.
life transition, and then it
Mm-hmm.
kind of generates clinicians of color that may be in your area.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a content creator, it's a group, and their
Okay.
Black mental wellness
Mm-hmm.
is probably about 4 or 5 Black women psychologists, and they're in the DMV area, and they do a
Mm,
lot of like social media content around mental health and mental wellness,
nice.
and they have a conference each year. It's both in person and virtual,
Mm-hmm.
and they just have different like programming. Um,
Okay.
so it's more like a community level. They don't necessarily do individual.
Okay.
And then there's for folks who like, I'm not into meditation, there are apps that can kind of help take you
Mm-hmm.
through and kind of ease you into it.
Mm-hmm.
Zen Care, Liberate is an app that focuses on BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and
Okay.
just kind of talking about different social, political issues and topics, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of taking you through meditation
Okay.
um, as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and then there's Headspace, where they kind of take you through breathing and
Mm-hmm.
meditation and stuff like that. So
Awesome.
just sometimes you have to kind of find the tools
Mm-hmm.
that you need. And the good thing about, I guess, the good and bad thing
Mm-hmm.
about the period and age that we're in is that technology can be very, very helpful when used in a very helpful and good way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, but these tools are not it's not a substitute for therapy, right?
Right.
For someone who's trained
Mm-hmm.
and licensed, and
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
yeah.
Wow, this is great. And I'll get those specific resources from Dr. Manson, post the links on the podcast channel.
Hmm.
Um, Dr. Mance, thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. Obviously, we can continue this conversation forever. There is so much to talk about. I did
Absolutely.
forget to tell you, I have a big trunk. I know you can't really, probably can't see my hand, how big I'm showing you. A big trunk, bigger than me. Just of journals that I've written over the
Mm,
years. It has been an amazing outlet for me.
Mm.
Of course, there are different times when I actually try to go back and read those, and I realize, oh my gosh, can't read that. It's like,
Right.
okay, it's staying in the trunk right now.
Yeah, and
It
that's
certainly
okay
has
too.
been. Hmm?
I was gonna say that's okay too.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's helpful to go back and read, and then sometimes it's like, no, I don't need to revisit.
Wow.
Yeah, but
So thank you so much. And I want to say, to everyone, we're talking about learning to truth for truth and love, and what learning means, and there's an emotional part for learning, right? There's an emotional connection to learning that oftentimes in our classroom we don't necessarily know how to connect it to. One of the things I love that you said, you made this comment that, oh, I love that if the only tool you use is a hammer, you see everything as a nail. I love that
mhm,
because it really reminds me of, if you're using the same strategy over and over again, you're going to get the same results. And
right,
sometimes, not only to get different results, but to see the problem differently.
right,
Sometimes you even have to try something different, right?
mhm,
Because I find that depending on the strategy I use, it's very revealing. Are students understanding?
right,
Are they responding?
mhm,
Um, and you also said something that really reminded me of the classroom space in terms of, uh, oh, can I execute? Right. And as soon as you said, I really thought about the students, student not being able to function and give us what we need or what
mm,
we want, and what that means for what needs to be worked on. Maybe starting to ask different questions.
right.
Um, is definitely important. So thank you so much. If you enjoy this episode, please like this video and subscribe. This podcast, Learning for Truth and Love, is available everywhere.
Okay,
And have a good day, everyone. And look forward to the next couple podcasts.
thank you.